Well, hello there, internets. Welcome to a very special episode of That's the Freddy trailer. Growing up, I was a huge fan of Nightmare on Elm Street, the whole series, loved Freddy Krueger. So, for the month of Halloween, could not think of a better subject to cover than A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, on this special episode, I'll be talking to author who wrote the book that you see behind me, Welcome to Elm Street, Wayne Byrne. And we'll also be talking to the cinematographer for my favorite film of the series, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, Mr. Roy H. Wagner. All of that is coming up, so let's get right into it, starting with Wayne. Like you, I got into Nightmare on Elm Street when I was, you know, too young to really appreciate those socio-political undertones that Wes Craven was weaving all throughout his stories. I was older when Scream came out. I was a little bit older with People Under the Stairs, and that was a little bit more in your face with the stuff. So I knew that Wes Craven had the was that was a theme in his films, but for me, even knowing that Nightmare on Elm Street, because I came into it at such an early age, I just kind of I've always remembered it and appreciated it for the things that I fell in love with it at 6 7 years old. How cool Freddy was, how funny Freddy was, how amazing the death sequences were. And it wasn't until reading your book that it really made all those things apparent. That what like I've always felt these things instinctually, like why Nightmare on Elm Street has always been my favorite horror franchise. It felt different, even though it was in the same vein as Friday the 13th and Halloween. Something about it felt a little bit more thoughtful, and I could never really put my finger on it until reading your book, and you had really like articulated that in such a strong, you made a very strong case for just how smart of a film it is disguised as a slasher piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you look at other big horror franchises of the 1980s in particular, I don't think there was as much depth in them, and I don't think they were as imaginative either as well. So that was one thing about Elm Street in general. I think that drew you in. It was the ideas that are floating in there, as Robert England said in the book. When you're watching these movies as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, and you're enjoying the pizza on the couch, you're not looking for those themes. You're not aware of them, but they do you do take them in and you do become aware of them over time, and especially as you revisit the films. And that's exactly what happened with me. As you said, I came to these movies when I was like 6 or 7 years old. So it's only over time that I realized, there's something deep at work here. And I've kind of an interest in kind of sociological stuff anyway, especially in art and movies and stuff. So for me, it was ripe for kind of analysis and for discussion.
Yeah.
And it's just
Uh,
it's one. I think it's one of the reasons why that franchise has kind of lasted, has kind of lingered into culture as long as it has, because I just don't see that kind of level of depth in other horror franchises.
Yeah, I mean, right at the core of it, it's like it attacks everything that like Friday the 13th, it's like I can avoid that easily. I just don't go to summer camp. Easy. Halloween, it's like I don't have any psycho family members that I have to be too concerned about. But Nightmare on Elm Street, it's like I have to go to sleep.
Yeah,
That he's taken the one place of solace that we have, and not only it's like you Freddy's gonna come for you eventually. You have to go to the place that Freddy is,
yeah,
and just the genius of giving yourself a nightmare landscape to create a horror film on. That's where like it justifies, like Nightmare on Elm Street can be as outlandish as all those other slasher films, but the very core of like the concept of it justifies all of the outlandishness, because there's no reason for Mike Myers to keep coming back to life the way he does in reality. But Freddy Krueger can do whatever the hell he wants because he's operating in the dream world, and that's just like if I was another horror filmmaker aside from Wes Craven, I would be so I'd just be so jealous that he came up with that concept to make horror films.
Yeah.
It's just so genius. But I like went way off the rails because I knew this was going to happen because I love the series so much and haven't even got. We'll get there. Before we do get there, I wanted to ask you, how long have you been writing, and what inspired you to start writing? All right, that seems like a good spot to put a pause on, Wayne. If you want the answer to that question and a whole lot more, his full interview will become available on December 15th. But stay tuned, there's going to be more of Wayne coming up at the end of this episode. But for right now, let's talk to Roy H. Wagner, the cinematographer of Dream Warriors. Well, in 1985 and 86, you shot plenty of horror films. You did Witchboard, Night Force, and Return to Horror High.
Night Force was
Um,
not a horror film. It was an action film with Linda Blair.
I saw Linda
Yes,
Blair, and
yes,
I made
yes.
an assumption. That's my
Yeah,
bad for
yeah,
stereotyping.
that's
Well,
okay.
at any rate, but what was very interesting to me was you and the director of Return to Horror High, Bill Froelich, would both go on to like find yourselves in the world of Freddy Krueger.
Mhm.
Bill would go on to direct Freddy's Nightmares in '89, and then a few months after wrapping Horror High, you'd start shooting Nightmare on Elm Street 3: Dream Warriors.
We were reading
Yeah.
that Wes Craven originally had an idea for the third Nightmare, from which he bought somewhat some would call it meta aspects. They were inspired from Return to Horror High for all of our '90s kids. Don't worry about it. And although the studio rejected that for being the ambitious part of it, what we want to know, was that concept behind that really true? Was it just a rumor, or was it just did you hear that? What's your input on that?
Well, there's a great deal to do with it because our assistant director in Return to Horror High was the producer on Nightmare. I mean, Rachel Talalay, and
Okay.
Okay.
she had given New Line Cinema the script for Return to Horror High because she wanted them to release it, and they didn't release it. Roger Corman's New World Pictures, I think, released it. But that script was around, and Wes really liked the script. I have to tell you that the Return to Horror High movie is not the complete story. There was a parallel story that was in that script that made that film much more dense than you were never really aware if you were in a nightmare or if you were in the reality. In
Oh,
Return to Horror
interesting.
High, and
Inception.
they just
Yeah.
didn't have, yeah, they just didn't have the money to do that. They did it a couple times, but they didn't have the money to do it. Bill Froelich is a dear friend, and I regret that film we never were able to really complete it properly. But the reason I got Nightmare was because of Rachel, and she had been the assistant director on Nightmare and or on Return to Horror High, and I didn't know that she had any connection to Nightmare. I'd never seen Nightmare on Elm Street. I'd never seen
Okay.
the first one. I'd never seen the second one until after I knew I was getting. I had seen Nightmare 1 and really was impressed with it, but I
Mhm.
hated Nightmare 2. And I just thought it was too open and exposed, and it left nothing to the imagination.
Yeah.
And so when Rachel called me up and said, "Would you meet with Chuck Nightmare?" I went, "Oh, okay." I didn't know who Chuck Russell was. I didn't know really what Nightmare was. It was just another movie. And went and met with him. I thought I had a great meeting. He hired somebody else. And so 3 days into the film, the shot of at UCLA where uh, they're going into the tower and where Freddy's hanging over the tower with his hands up,
Hmm.
master. There were like, and the scene in the church. Those were all shot by another cinematographer, and they were so far behind that they called me one night at UCLA, and I was devastated. I didn't get to film. So suddenly you get there was no there was nothing but beepers back then. There was no cell
Mhm.
phones, nothing like that. So I get this beep 911 with his number. I didn't know what the number was. I go to the phone booth and call. It's Rachel. She says, "I need for you to take over Nightmare on Elm Street. We're in big trouble. I'm going to get fired." And I was kind of pissed, because I'd not started it. And I said, okay, because I wasn't doing anything. So I decided to go to UCLA and meet Chuck again, and so my first night on Nightmare on Elm Street was when John Saxon drives his truck up to the graveyard, the junkyard. That was
Mhm.
the very first shot, and I'd fired the whole crew. We had my crew, so that was a huge lighting setup to do the very first shot, and they were all judging to see if I was going to be faster, going to save the money and do all this stuff. Now there's something else that he did, the other cinematographer, the scene where she's in her bed
Mhm.
and she wakes up and she's no longer in her room. She's actually outside the nightmare house, and he had done that. And the gag was that once she gets up and sees what's happening, the camera has to race across from where she's at to the house, and then go into the house because there was a shot that they had to go into the house, and they had to go. It had to go at such high speed; it was almost like a helicopter flying low over the ground, getting the audience into the house before they could get back away. Because in horror films, if you do a point of view shot, the audience has to face the monster before you do. And
Mhm.
it's a trick that we all use. And so this was an idea of getting the audience in there quicker than they wanted to. This little girl on a bicycle and all this stuff. And that shot had not worked. It failed miserably. As soon as he changed film speed, which was technically what you have to do, and yet make it appear as if you're still working at 24 frames per second, uh, it has to feel like it's gliding like a ghost, a supernatural spirit. It didn't work that way. So after we shot that first night, which was all the graveyard stuff with all the cars, the lights blinking and digging up Freddy's grave uh, and all of those things. In fact, that's me right there in front of Freddy's grave,
Nice.
in Freddy's grave, and I'm thinking to myself, what did I get myself into here?
Oh, that is awesome. I'm gonna
That's a
it,
serious piece of hardware.
yes, that's so crazy to be standing right there. I know
Yeah,
it doesn't look like we're looking at it. We're looking at the monitor over here. We can see it.
that's
That's
right.
awesome. So
That's
the
nice.
that
Nice.
I know you didn't shoot the marionette scene, but
I shot the marionette
oh,
scene.
you
The
did shoot that
thing in the
scene. Okay.
hospital, but Freddy above the building, I didn't. I shot Freddy, but I didn't shoot the building, which would.
Okay, you shot that plate. Okay, that's what that makes that scene even more impressive to me because that was one of the questions coming up, but you kind of brought it up, so I'm gonna jump to it now. That scene holds up so well, in my opinion, like for especially the time that it was done, and now knowing that it's the work of two cinematographers, like piecing something together like that.
So the
And I
hallway
was just
really tough. The
what.
puppeteering with the young boy being puppeteered, where you can see the veins or arteries coming out of his hands
Mhm.
and his feet. That was really hard because our makeup people and effects people couldn't find something that would be elastic enough to spring when he was walking, and they were breaking, they were snapping all the time. And so the shot of him walking with his hands up like this, where the camera's facing him, we actually attached him and the makeup, all the makeup, onto the dolly. So he had C stands over the top of the camera and everything, holding him up. And then him walking with the puppet with the side shot where it's panning him down the hallway. That was two separate pieces of film. That was the plate, which was the hallway, panning the hallway, and then the other shot was on the blue screen with him as the puppet, and we had to marry those two things together. That was probably the hardest thing we did on that film because it never really worked.
Are you happy with the results?
I am astonished at the results. I'm
Okay, yeah,
astonished the results worked as well as they did.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, and like everything in that scene works so well that like it all worked together.
But just hearing him say what he said,
The
created.
sound is what really like the wah, 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 wah. It feels like you pulled the
This my
hangnail too
favorite thing
far.
the Welcome to Prime Time bitch scene. And that was done.
Oh, the crime
We
scene.
shot her as a separate piece, and then the television set was and her being brought into the television set was her when we were here by the television set when she came to us. And then there was a shot behind her where you literally see her being embraced by the robot, bringing her in, and that was a puppet. And then when Freddy's head goes up through the TV set, that was shot in reverse. And then that's where he says, "Welcome to prime time, bitch." And I can hear him still saying that to Chuck, saying, "Hey, Chuck, how about this?" And it took us a week to shoot that.
Let me tell you something, sir. I love everything you're telling me now because I think I almost know that it's a lost art because nowadays it's not all CGI, but really it's something that it's a different, when you do something practical or invent something that's never been done. And even if it does take a week, if that memory is going to last on for decades, who cares? Because you're giving us something we'll probably never see again. And I think it's almost a lost art to really be creative. Like, we don't know how we're going to do it. Well, let's just try.
Are you about to get into Robert Englund? Can I get
No.
into
I just wanted to comment
okay.
on what he was just saying about this art that he's talking about.
We were all, the best thing about being a cinematographer is it's three-dimensional chess. And truthfully, so you're always trying to find your way out of the box. And one of your questions was, what's your favorite thing that you did on Nightmare? And my favorite thing I did was probably something you never even thought about. It's when Nancy falls through the chair. It's simplest trick we did. We lifted the chair up on apple boxes. You didn't see the apple boxes because from our camera position, it looked like it was a part of the room. But we lifted that up and we slit the chair with holes in it so that when she would fall, you wouldn't see those slits, but she would fall right straight through down into pads below that chair. And so what we did is we shot a blank of the room with the chair, and then we shot her in that falling through. And what we had to do was optically hide what was underneath the chair and put that blank piece of film in there so we could see what was under the chair. That's the problem with CG. The CG takes you out of it's what you see is incomprehensibly impossible. It's against nature. And what I love are effects where you could suggest to yourself, okay, intellectually or emotionally, you could say, well, that could happen.
Yeah. It's tangible.
When you can do that, it's more frightening.
I wanted to talk to you about Chuck Russell for a minute because I have one more connection that I found very interesting. The Dream Warriors, this was Chuck Russell's first time directing. Witchboard was your first credited horror film, at least according to IMDb. And at least as of 2019, Chuck Russell is signed on to direct the remake of Witchboard. And Chuck Russell has also directed The Blob, Jim Carrey's The Mask, Bless the Child, The Scorpion King, among others. What was he like to work with? And did you know about the Witchboard remake or heard anything about that?
I've been asked to do it. It's not happening yet. It's a good script. I loved Witchboard. I had so much fun on that. Kevin Tenney was a lot of fun to work with. That was a fun movie to work with. And the same crew that did Nightmare did Witchboard.
That'd be so interesting if you and Chuck Russell collaborated again on like something that you both were like firsts for both of you guys.
Horror films were my favorite things anyway. I don't like horror films as much as I love ghost stories. I love The Innocents with Deborah Carr, and I love The Uninvited with Ray Milland. That's a great ghost story because they don't try to explain it away. It's a real ghost.
Well, let me say this. Well, speaking of things you love, at least from our perspective, Robert Englund seems like such a giving actor as far as understanding how to give the crew what they need and to get the best shot. What was it like working with him personally?
Robert would sit in a chair for 5 and 7 hours. And, I did Beauty and the Beast, and we had the same makeup team on that we had on Nightmare. And when we did the pilot, we had, I can't think of his name now, the head makeup artist that did the Beast makeup. You sat in a chair for 7 hours and had people touching your face for that long. It can make you pretty irritable, pretty frustrated. I don't think I could do that. He would come out. He was always on time. He would come out of the makeup room, and he was as generous and kind and as and considerate and sweet a guy I've ever worked with. just an amazing guy. Not a big guy at all. He was a little guy. He is a little guy.
Mhm.
But just if all movie stars could be like Robert Englund, this would be a lot easier business to work in. But Robert was just I can't say enough good things about Robert. He was a contributor in every single solitary way. And the fact that he'd done now the third one, he was in the midst of doing the third one, made him very, very knowledgeable.
Mhm.
We had on the other side, we had this amazing team. We had Chuck Russell, Bruce Wagner, which is an incredibly dark writer. He's dark and as funny as can be, and Frank Darabont. And
Yeah.
so here we have these extraordinary, extraordinary talented people coming up with ideas on the set, and I worked more hours on that film than, and I operated as well as being a director of photography, which in the old days doing non-union films, which this was one of, you did both, and working long hours, it wasn't unusual to fall off a dolly or fall asleep. You know, it was pretty normal, but it was a remarkable journey to be on. And everybody on that film was there because they wanted to be there. They were trying to, production designer, the camera crew, everybody wanted this to be good. They saw
Yeah.
it as a legacy piece and they wanted it to be something that would be valuable. And I have to say, my gaffer has done wonderful things. My key grip works on the biggest films in the world, like Dracula and Forrest Gump and films like that. So they went on to do incredibly big films, but they were a remarkable team to have with you on that film.
Let me ask you this: were there any inspirations as far as the style of shooting that went into Dream Warriors? Anything
Dark.
that you could tell us? Oh, dark, dirty.
Yeah, they were so unhappy with 2 because they saw Freddy too well. And
Yeah,
this,
and he came out into the real world, like, which broke all the rules.
it was not that the makeup looked bad.
No, it was a very interesting take on Freddy, but
But it
yeah, there
violated
was
the
too
rules.
much of him.
It violated the rules of horror films, is that you don't show the monster.
Yeah,
Even
Yeah.
the monster's
the
scary,
Jaws rule.
you don't see him.
Yeah.
Cloverfield.
And I think Frank Darabont. I know I just butchered that name, but
Oh.
he like that. I didn't realize that he was a writer on it until I was doing the research for this interview, and that makes so much sense. Why? Because the part 3 is like the darkest tones and the most, and that's like the first time Freddy was turning people's real life weaknesses on them, like against them.
Let's get high.
And it was like as hilarious as part 3 was, I think that was like
That's what made it scary, was the humor.
yeah,
Because
and that's what 4 was lacking.
you were not afraid. And I've always said that comedy and horror have a great deal of similarity.
Dennis the
happen
Menace
in
grown
threes.
up or something.
Things happen in threes. You scare the audience first initially, and then you let them go. The second time you kind of scare them. They think they're going to get scared more, but you don't scare them that much. And the third time you scare the shit out of them.
Yeah,
And
a perfect example of that is actually the next question about the infamous sexy nurse scene. That's one of those. It made me. I think I was like 11 or 12 the first
kids
time
watched
I
the show.
saw
Made
it.
you watch. It made you what?
No, it didn't. It gave me very conflicting feelings because it was like it was lust to terrified in like a matter of 3 minutes. But apparently, like Rodney Eastman, who's in that scene, he there. I read that he said he would be standing up to appear and to be strapped to the bed. And he compared the experience to a crucifixion. And according to IMDb, it says he was spread eagle for so long that he actually passed out. So I know you were talking about the long hours and that you had passed out or on the dolly at the same time. So it seemed like on the set of Nightmare on Elm Street, people going to Freddy Land was like a running theme because of the strenuous hours. Do you recall that at all?
Yeah, of course. The scene in
So a man got crucified. Of course, I remember.
with the nurse, the scene with the nurse, we shot that with her coming in and going up to his bed, and then the tongue was shot in reverse. It was on him, and then it was retracted because we couldn't get it to spit out. And all that was done after we wrapped production. Him being on that bed, the bed falling away, and you seen Freddy held below him, that we'd shot during production. And there were 2 rooms. There was one room normal,
Hmm.
and the way we originally shot it was Robert Englund came into the room and did the tongue thing. Well, there's the scene right there behind me. And
Nice.
and then after they thought, well, we need a little bit of sex in here, and so they did in second unit. We shot all of this stuff, and that
Yeah.
scene right there with her
Perfect
pulling
timing.
away was shot in reverse, and the puppets. I have to tell you, the tongues were remarkable. You could walk right up to them, and the puppeteering was just
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, the all the effect. I mean, and the Freddy snake was apparently a little too realistic looking from what we've
No,
read.
no, this hold on. Before he gets into the snake, what I want to know about, I don't eat pork
Oh.
anymore. Could you tell us about the roasted pig?
Oh, that was horrible.
Was it though? Porky survived.
That was a horrible scene.
Oh wait,
And you know
I gave you that question for a reason. You'll like this.
the reason that it's such a horrible scene. I mean, they cut a hole in the table. That was on the stage. I was on set, and I was operating as well, so I had to be closer than anybody except for the person doing the puppeteering. And we did this dolly shot around the pig, and then the pig has to jump to the camera. And they couldn't afford a puppet. They couldn't afford a puppet pig, so they bought a real pig from a butcher, and they got all the stuff, the innards out, and the prop master had to stick his hands up into the pig and make it leap. Now, there's a job I don't ever want to think about having.
Yeah.
It was bad enough for me just being there, and that smell was just horrible, horrible. It was the worst smell I've ever smelled in my life, and we, of course, couldn't be done in one take. It had to be done take after take after take until we got it right. So it was pretty dreadful, and it was the days before we had remote heads. I mean, we did use a remote head.
I thought you were supposed to say for days before Peter. I thought that's where he was going.
Probably that too.
Yeah, it was dead. So I don't know.
Speaking of Peter,
it worked.
Freddy Snake.
Yeah, that when I saw it, I could smell that story when I read about that. That's
Yeah.
I don't know what's worse, having to get it blown in your like right there in your face, and like I'm sure it wasn't just like a one and done, right? Like
Yeah. It was like 6 takes.
of course.
If you look at Wayne's book, I gave him a lot of material. There's pictures. I'll send you pictures of behind the scenes photographs like this one.
I wanted to talk about the Freddy snake because we always hear the story about how it was originally too pink and phallic looking. So
It was
green.
definitely that.
Okay, so green. So you guys put, or not you specifically, maybe, but green goo was put on it last minute to try and fix it. Is there any more to that story than what we've heard so frequently?
I was always working ahead of Chuck because I had to try to make sure that we were prepared to at least light. And so I was always working ahead of him. I think we were doing the spiral staircase scene, which was a forced perspective set, and just about 100 feet away was the living room set, which that living room set was at least 4 or 5 different sets, duplicate sets. One where the snake went through the walls, and one that was used to get the snake to come to the door and attack Nancy and Patricia, and then the Freddy snake scene. And the only way we could do that was that snake set had to be off the ground by about, I think it was like 8 feet or 10 feet, because the snake had to go up out of the floor and come up and then come back down and drop to the ground. And that's when he started gobbling her.
That was another scene that was done in reverse too, right?
Yes, but the snake going up, that was done normal. We had a camera crane underneath it that would lift the snake up, and it was like a how do I say this? It was like a penis wasn't erect. It was
Yes.
A flaccid
Yes.
dick. Okay.
It was like
That's
a penis wasn't erect. That was
so that
something
was the
erect.
first realization. Like who?
I saw them putting it together. I forget who the puppeteer was, Phil Tippett or somebody.
Probably
Okay.
Ron Jeremy.
Just the tippet. Okay.
And I saw the snake without the goo on. I went, "Oh my God, this is a penis." And I thought, well, okay, that maybe there's a lot of sexual innuendo in Nightmare on Elm Street. So I went to Chuck. I said, "Hey, Chuck, come over here. I think you should come take a look at this."
What are you
And we
saying?
were both standing there, and he said, "Oh my God." I said, "Yeah. Is that what you want? You want it to be a penis?" And he said,
No.
"I think, yeah, it's really
This man.
funny. But I don't think that Rewind would like that at all."
Yeah.
I see where you guys are getting off the rails. That's not a penis.
This interview is so money right now.
It's not about what I want, Roy.
Let me ask you something.
That's
What's your favorite death of the film?
My favorite death?
Yeah.
My favorite death is easily the marionette scene, just because it is so effective. And I put that in here. Like that the tendons, the being pulled from his legs and his wrists, and just the taboo nature of Freddy making somebody who's in a hospital appear as though that they've
This is one of my favorite
themselves.
scenes right here with the nun.
There we
It's when
go.
Craig Lawson goes into the rundown part of the hospital,
Uh-huh.
and he walks through all this clutter, and then gets to the altar, and there's this nun in white that turns to him and says that there was a nun. It was obviously her. There was a nun that was trapped in this room, and she was raped by all these maniacs. And it's my favorite line in the whole movie.
The bastard son of 100 maniacs.
Yeah.
I
He
like
shot
it.
this thing on Halloween.
That's
Man.
I saw the production was like October 15th to September. So you guys were like right in the thick of Halloween season. That had
I
to be so
remember
ominous.
This was at the UCLA, no, not UCLA, the Veterans Administration Hospital, which is still there. It's a haunted place. It's abandoned. It's in Westwood, on the opposite side from the freeway from Westwood. And that scene was shot in the attic of that hospital. And the crew hated it, because if you walked around in the hospital by yourself, and you were always having to, it was scary. And we shot this scene on Halloween night. I thought, that's fun. I'll remember this the rest of my life. That I shot a horror film on Halloween.
Oh wait. Okay.
That's so awesome.
Now that is awesome. But let me ask you this: do you remember this?
It's a good segue right into
right, because
first.
can you either confirm or deny? Do you know anything about the infamous? I'm not going to say who did it. The Freddy glove that might have been supposedly stolen from set. Now, some sources say it was part of an ongoing prank between Wes Craven and Sam Raimi, and other sources report Chuckster, the prankster Russell, stated that it was stolen by two obsessed fans. One fan who snuck onto set. You have anything to say about that, here, Dave?
Well, I know that I don't think it was a joke, because it was everybody was freaked out, because the hat was stolen.
Oh, no.
The Freddy hat was stolen, as was the glove. And so there was this big, huge, frightening thing about, what are we going to do? We can't find the glove. We can't. And so the person who had made the original prop was working with us, and he was able to rebuild the hand. But the hat, nobody knew where to get the hat. They finally found it. I think it took a couple of days to find it.
That's wild.
But
I was waiting for somebody to bring it back.
Wes Craven was on the set one time, and he was not happy. He was not a happy person, because it wasn't his script we were making.
Wow.
Was he there for Nancy's death? I heard that he had a part. He wanted to have a part in that, since he brought her to life. He went, damn, Wes, what are you doing?
No, it wasn't. It was earlier on. I can see him standing there, but it wasn't. I can't remember what set we were on. I think it was the Freddy Snake scene where it's going through the floor.
Okay.
Nancy did not. Nancy's a friend of mine, but she did not want to do Nightmare 3 at all. She was going to school. She wasn't sure she wanted to be in the film industry anymore. So she was kind of annoyed by the whole process at that time. Now she's, she's married, she's got kids, and she's a much happier person. But at that time, she was not that happy. This is Steven Spielberg's mother-in-law from his previous wife, from the one he has now. And Patricia, that was her first movie.
Yeah, I read that. Well, hold on. Who was Steven Spielberg's mother-in-law?
The one that's playing her, that lady right there.
Oh, okay. I'm trying not to watch the screen because I will just completely stop listening to you and just end up watching the movie, which I just did last night. So I'm trying
Go
to
watch, because I
focus.
got a question for him. So now earlier you mentioned what your favorite with the nun. You mentioned your favorite scene/sequence, but I want to ask you this before we move on from Dream Warriors. Is there a memory or anything that you'd like to share that you think the fans of the film would like to know or they've never known before?
It was fun. It was a lot of laughing. There was nothing scary about anything we were doing. It was all fun. We were having a great time. Lots of practical jokes. We're working long hours. I mean, there was one scene where the walls, Freddy comes through uh, uh, the insane room, the padded room, and his hands come through the walls, and that was pretty dangerous. People were sucking in these feathers, and some people got really sick during that scene. Um, and there was another scene, the breaking of the mirrors scene was pretty dangerous as well, and and also very complicated. Same process as the Freddy puppeteering scene was all done the same way. And those two scenes were the most difficult. I remember one night, uh, Chuck had an expression. I asked him one time. I said, "How do you define what a director is? Give me a definition of a director." And he said, "The last man standing."
Hmm.
I said, "Oh, okay." And I see how that works. And
Mhm.
Chuck was relentless. He would not give up. Production was on his tail every second of every day, saying, "You got to wrap. You've got to wrap. We don't have any more money. We can't do this anymore. You got to wrap." And Chuck would go, "Oh, okay," and then he'd go on and do another take. And it was constant. We were overtime constantly on that film because Chuck was not going to give up until he made the movie he wanted to make. And
Yeah.
it was tough on us, but by the same token, it wouldn't be the movie it is without Chuck having fought for it.
We want to give a huge thank you to Mr. Wagner for giving us his time. If you want to check out his full interview, it'll be available on December 8th. For right now, let's get back to Wayne. I felt a very strong connection to you when in the book, you were talking about how you got into Nightmare on Elm Street when Freddy grabbed your attention at your local video store. It was 1989. You were 6 years old. I was also introduced and enamored by Freddy around that same age, and the same year. Are you like 39, 40?
I'm 39 in a couple of weeks.
Okay, yeah, I just turned 39 last month. It was right around the age of 6, 7 that my cousins got me into Freddy, older cousins. I have a daughter who just turned 7, and I like I've tried to like introduce her to Freddy. She's terrified just by like I have the doll, like I have to hide the doll usually because she doesn't even like the sight of him, gives her the creeps. And it's curious to me like why why do you think people like us were attracted to Freddy at such a young age?
Well, I think there's several reasons for that. I think one of them is probably one of the most obvious is he was actually marketed to us. Strangely enough, I mean, when you think about it, he's a horrendous, child killer. And I used to go to there was this budget store in my town called Donald's Walk Around, and you guys probably have an equivalent. It's like I guess like a dollar store kind of thing.
Uh-huh.
Everything's in there. It's really cheap. So yeah, I used to go in there when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and you could get your Freddy Krueger lunchbox, your Freddy Krueger doll, your Freddy Krueger glove. The toys which were aimed at our age group, which was very strange now when you think about it.
Yeah.
But so apart from the fact that he was marketed to young people, I think one of the crucial things is two other things. One is the films are so imaginative and so much fun. As I say, compared to some of the other major horror franchises, there's a lot of imagination in there. There's a lot of surreality. So
Mhm.
I'm not saying it's cartoonish, but I think there's an element of playful visuals which appeal to kids, younger people who are used to, say, the kind of wild anarchic world of cartoons. There's an
Yeah.
element of that. And I also think because Freddy Krueger has personality, he's not just this faceless killing machine with a mask. He has the one-liners. He can be very witty and charming, but he can also be, very cruel and whatever else. So
Let's get high.
I think there's multiple reasons why he would appeal to us at that age. And for me, I think it was Freddy's Nightmares. I really have to kind of credit the TV show, because I used to watch that. It used to be on every Friday night on this channel we had. And it was just around about kind of my bedtime. So I'd get my dad to record it for me, and then I'd watch it on Saturday morning. So my Saturday morning cartoons was Freddy's Nightmares.
That's
So,
the 80s, man.
Yeah.
A very special time.
And the thing about that show is it's kind of like a Twilight Zone kind of situation where Freddy's not really involved in the stories, but he is the host. He's the wraparound guy, and he pops up every now and again between halfway through the show, and he'll say something funny. So there was an element of him being this kind of inviting, creepy kind of guy who was funny as well. So you liked him. It's only as you got older and you understood what he stood for that he became creepy. But for me, he was just a cool guy to watch every Saturday morning.
Yeah, that was me too. I never really looked too much further into it than, I don't really care how he got to where he's at. I'm enjoying what he's doing where he's at. It's fun. It's entertaining.
Yeah.
It's prime time, bitch.
Mhm.
I really resonate. Well, Robert Englund's statements kind of on this subject really resonated with me. Your book very appropriately ends with a beautiful, thoughtful paragraph from him. He was talking about how Freddy lives on because so many of us grew up with him from such a young age, and we associate him with the pleasant memories of growing up, like gathered around the TV with loved ones, eating pizza, like that. Freddy for me does have that nostalgic place in my heart. That's that you can't be disconnected from that era where things were a little bit things felt a little bit safer in a weird way. Like, we could go out. I don't know. I wanted to get into this with you too, with like because A Nightmare on Elm Street takes place in suburban America, and I was wondering how that translated for you. Like, was that like that's like my neighborhood, or is it for you as like, oh, that's what it's like over there?
Yeah, I guess there was an element of that where I grew up. It wasn't quite as, how do you say, white picket fence America kind of style, imagery, but similar kind of, housing estates, where everything was kind of nice and quiet and a lot of families. So it did resonate to a degree. But as I mentioned in the book, I think one of the great things about the themes of Elm Street is, it's the phrase, Freddy's phrase, every town has an Elm Street. And I think it comes down to the fact that it doesn't really matter if it's a poor, economically deprived housing estate or a middle class one or a, bourgeois, upper middle class, whatever. They all suffer from some of the same afflictions, broken homes, divorce, addiction, people with issues. It doesn't really matter what kind of economic situation you're in. I think you can relate to some of the issues that are in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, when I was young, very young, and I was watching these films, of course, those weren't necessarily things I was thinking of. But yeah, something on the visual level did strike me as familiar. That it was just kind of nice, quiet, tree-lined streets, and it's like, yeah, it could have been my neighborhood, could be anywhere. And it's the
Yeah.
kind of thing that, it does resonate on a kind of some kind of subconscious level, that you're living in that same kind of environment as the characters are, and that
Yeah.
your neighborhood could be invaded by, something like Freddy Krueger.
What was the like? I'm sure like there's the obvious answer that you're a huge fan of the series from a young age, and it had an impact on your life, obviously. But what was there a particular like reason why you felt it was time in your career to focus on the Elm Street? And I'm sure that it had to be like an undertaking because of your love for the franchise and wanting to
Yeah.
give it the best justice that it could possibly be given. Like, I'm sure that it had to be an undertaking to look forward to. Like, how'd you realize that you were ready to do that and that you wanted to write that book?
Well, it had been kind of an idea in the back of my mind for a few years, and I have taught about it at classes. So I've spoken in depth about these things in kind of academic contexts, and plus I've written about it for magazines down the years, for anniversaries and stuff like that. So it's not my first time kind of talking about it, writing about it, but I always felt I was never really satisfied with the kind of level of analysis out there on it in the other books that are out there. A lot of them, as I said, are more about the making of aspect of it, and kind of interviewing all the familiar faces and, what they did with the character and all that kind of thing. And that was never really what I was interested in. So when I had the opportunity, if you notice with each of these books that I'm doing, I'm kind of paying tribute to my childhood and all the movies and filmmakers that have informed who I am today and what I do. So, Burt Reynolds, my favorite actor, Tom DiCillo, my favorite director, Nick McLean, one of my favorite cinematographers. So it's come around to, my favorite horror, my favorite franchise, that kind of thing. And just because I had the opportunity, now that I'm able to be published, publishers or editors, they seem to like me for whatever reason. So, I've been kind of successful when I go to them with pitches and ideas. So I went to my publisher and they really liked the idea and they said, yeah, go for it. And in terms of like the scale of it, ever since the Tom DiCillo book came out, every book I take on, I give myself a year because I just like I like the pressure of it. It kind of gets your ass moving, to get the interviews done, get the prose written, get everything, get the photos together. I think if you take any longer than a year, it probably gets a bit sluggish. I mean, a year is a long enough time to be working on one subject because
Yeah.
I don't know about any other writers, but when I'm writing a book on whatever subject it is, that's all I kind of live with for that year. So for a year, I only lived with Nightmare on Elm Street movies or Wes Craven movies. It had to be associated with what I do. If I'm working on a book, I just can't switch off and put on any other random movie. It can only be related to the book. So I kind of get obsessed for a year, but it
Yeah.
works. It works for me. I don't know. That would probably be too quick for some other writers, but
That-
I was lucky in that I got some good people on board and I got great interviews. And when you get good interviews, sometimes the books, it helps write the books. They write
Mhm.
themselves really.
Yeah, I really like that idea of giving yourself a year, like putting a cap on it
Yeah.
because yeah, I feel like that's a really smart idea, especially when you're dealing with something that you love so much, because it could easily become an obsession that, like, you know what, I'm doing a 12-volume encyclopedia set on it actually, and it's gonna be my whole life.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's probably like, and you also know that this is, yeah, like you can fully dive in and 100% commit knowing that there's an end game. Like, you'll get to come out of the water and watch some other kind of movies in 365 days. That seems really smart, a really smart approach to it. I might have to borrow that with some things because
Yeah.
yeah, that's sometimes something that makes it so hard to start is not knowing when you're gonna, like,
Yeah.
so many creative projects, there isn't really, unless it's self-imposed, there's not really a deadline or an end game. You just
Well,
kind of,
I feel blessed to be able to do it because I had that kind of difficult way in to get here. I just while I can do it, while publishers and editors like me enough to release my work, I'm going to do it. So it took me so long to get to that point of the first book, to say, nobody's going to release this book for me. I'm going to have to do it myself. So that was my approach. I wrote the book that I wanted to buy, and so that's been my approach ever since. I'm just taking the bull by the horns. Every
mm,
year when I come to the end, near the end of each book, I start thinking about the next book and I try and get a deal for that. So it kind of rolls straight into the next project. So I don't really have a whole lot of time to kind of celebrate one release, after another. I kind of once I finish the Elm Street book, I'm gone straight into Walter Hill. And once I finish Walter Hill, I'm gone straight into something else. And that's just the way it's been. And that's the way I really like it because, as I say, I never thought I'd be here doing this. So I'm just going to keep doing it while I can, while my body allows me to stay up as late as possible.
That kind of alludes to a future question that I had. I might as well throw it in here now. So like towards the end of your year of writing the current book, do you just kind of start like my question was going to be like how do you know what the next subject matter is going to be? Do you just kind of like just let your mind be open in those last few months or leading up to the as you're finishing up a project just to
Yeah.
see what speaks to you?
Usually it's something natural. It's a desire inside that just I feel, compelled to work on or write about. As I say, like with Elm Street, once I was kind of wrapping up that, I was watching a lot of Walter Hill movies, and I was thinking, why is there no books on Walter Hill? The man's been making movies for 50 years, and there's no single tome covering his career. So that just felt natural, and you kind of have to think, am I going to be happy doing this for a year? And if I don't question it, well, then I know. You know what I mean? There's sometimes you might think of a director or a certain series of movies, and you go, well, how happy am I going to be just spending a year on this subject? And if I don't question that, say with Walter or with Elm Street, well, then I know it's the project for me. Now, my next project, the next book that's coming out is different because I'm co-writing it with somebody, and they were the one who kind of the genesis began with them. So, but again, I love the subject and I love my co-author, so that was just natural. But in terms of coming up with the ideas, it's generally something instinctual. It's a passion within me, and it's all these people and all this art that I feel should be written about but hasn't been. So I'll just do it.
Yeah, that's I've done a few feature films, and that's really how the next one comes to mind for me too. Is I something in me just feels ready to dive into a feature film again, to write a script and go into a 6 to 12 month per weekend, every weekend production, and spend a year in post production. Like it's a commitment. So I never go into it lightly. But even with that said, there's really not much like logical analysis that goes into it either. It's just it's more or less a feeling. Like first, it's a feeling of I'm ready to do this again, and then it could be as simple as riding around in the car and a song comes on and I just get inspired, and it's an idea and I may have 3 or 4 ideas, and I don't beat myself up if they're not the ideas that end up getting meat thrown on them and turning into something that tangible, because like it's the idea that finally sticks, that moves me enough to take the next step, is the one that I know that I'm going to be able to commit to for what the rest of the journey requires to see the finished movie at the end of the day. So I could definitely appreciate where like you can't really, like, you could maybe have a Excel spreadsheet of potential ideas, a bucket list of ideas that you want to do, and even with that list in front of your face, the universe, or whatever we want to call it, might have a completely different idea for you that inspires you to just move to go with that one right now, and it gets number one when you didn't even consider it before. um
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's the only way to approach work. I think unless you're literally looking for something to do for financial gain. I mean, I couldn't imagine spending a year on a book that I wouldn't my heart wouldn't be in. And I've toyed with some ideas, and I even started a project at one stage with a publisher, and I was like, okay, it's not going to work. It's not for me. It just wasn't coming together, even though it was something I was kind of a movie I loved, and I just thought this is going to be a slog. And you
yeah
see, you have to remember as well, when you're approaching these projects, everybody you bring into the project has to be at that level. You know what I mean? I think, the people you're interviewing and everything else, or the people you're working with, they have to have that same passion about your subject, or else things are just going to falter along the way. So, I've been
yeah
lucky on the projects that I have worked on. I got great people on board. I think I've only ever done maybe 1 or 2 interviews that I ended up not using for whatever reason. But on the whole, I've interviewed, I think
yeah
over 100
well
people at this stage, and they've all been gems.
Well, with Welcome to Elm Street, you talked to dozens of people responsible for bringing the Nightmare franchise to life, from all the series, the TV, the series with the film series, the TV series, across the board, cinematographers, directors, makeup effects artists. Um, I'm sure all of that was amazing, but I'm really curious what it was like to speak to. I just couldn't imagine talking to Robert Englund, Freddy Krueger himself, on the phone, and I feel like I will get. This is as close to reliving that experience as possible as asking you how you felt, because I feel like our relationship to Freddy Krueger is very similar coming up.
Oh man, it was surreal because well, first off, he rang me, so there was the whole kind of anticipation of waiting for the phone to ring to pick up and answer Freddie. It's
Yeah.
just this completely weird thing. But Robert England is a writer or interviewer's dream. He loves to talk, and he will talk for hours about everything and anything. And one thing we really got off course a lot of time. You wouldn't tell it from the interviews in the book because they're very, we pick out the parts we wanted. But for that conversation, we went off topic talking about Ireland because Robert loves it here, and he was telling me about these restaurants that he goes to in Dublin, tell me about the menu, about the fish that he does get and the white wine. And I know these restaurants, so it was kind of a little thrill, knowing that Robert goes there. But he knew about my Burt Reynolds book, and he was
Nice.
interested in that because one of Burt's movies that I talk about is one of my favorites, which is Hustle, 1975 film noir, which is really good. And Robert has the distinction of being the only man, or at least the first man, to kill Burt Reynolds in a movie. So, Robert's a small bit part as a villain. In the end, he kills Burt's character. But so he was talking to me about that, about Burt, and then he said, send me a copy of your book. I want that book on my shelf. And I was like, that's weird. I was
Yeah,
like, I'm gonna be signing and sending a book to Robert England. This is crazy.
yeah.
But I did, and he got back to me. He said that he loved it. He thought it was brilliant. So it was one of the highlights of my career to date. Just getting
That
to share a couple of hours with Robert and just talk about Elm Street, but also just talk about other things and chat about Ireland and just life. He's a really great interviewee, and one of the things I was so happy with was because you also have to, because of my approach to this, the kind of, like I say, the sociological stuff. Not everybody you interview sees the series like that, or wants to talk about the themes and the intellectual ideas. They might just want to talk about what they did on a particular movie, which is could be special effects, or it could be just their acting, or it could be whatever. And that's
Mhm.
fine. You adjust accordingly. You get the temperature of the interview fairly quickly. But Robert met me on that level precisely. He is all about the sociological stuff, the political stuff, the subtext, the themes, because that's what him and Wes used to talk about in the early days of coming up with ideas for the character and what it was all about. So
Yeah.
Robert, as you know in the book, gave me some great stuff about that. I mean, he talks about the genesis of Nightmare on Elm Street going back to the assassination of JFK and the civil rights
Yeah.
movement and the cultural upheaval of the 60s. I mean, I was in heaven listening to that because that's exactly the kind of stuff I wanted to talk about. So to get Roberts, he was a dream,
And
absolute
that's
dream.
and he does it in such an articulate way. Like, if like when I was reading about his stuff about the tying it back to the JFK and being like the death of uh
American Innocence.
yeah, like that being conveyed by the wrong person could easily be like, oh, come on, man, you are stretching big time. But the
Yeah,
way he lays it out is just
yeah,
so like, holy shit, you're right. That's you've got a compelling argument there.
yeah.
And I've always been surprised, like when I don't remember, like in my teens when I first started seeing him in interviews and how articulate he was, and the respect and the reverence that he applied to the craft of acting, even when bringing a character like Freddy Krueger to life, his deep, like he had a methodical approach to the character, and it was so cool to see that when he talk about the way he would think about playing the role and what different things entailed. But it's strange. I haven't actively sought out, like, as much as like Freddy Krueger is one of the most impactful figures of my childhood, easily. Like Ferris Bueller, Freddy Krueger. Those two probably were like made up the whole of my personality. It could be summed up in those two. But I like And usually when somebody has a really strong impact on me, like a director or an actor, I get on IMDb, I see everything else they've done, and I just go down the rabbit hole and I become a diehard fan. But Robert Englund, it's weird. I love his work as Freddy Krueger, but I've never sought out Robert Englund films. Um,
I
so I
was
don't
thinking,
like to admit it, but I think my allegiance ends with Freddy as much as I love Robert. Like, what's your experience been as far as Robert Englund? I know you talked about his, you love the Burt Reynolds film where he's the only person to ever kill Burt Reynolds on screen, or the first. But have you do you consider yourself a Robert Englund fan?
yeah, I think he definitely adds something to the screen whenever he's on it. He has a huge personality and a huge screen presence, even though he's quite diminutive in a way.
This is God.
He's not a large imposing figure, but there's something about the way he carries himself on the screen. He knows the screen. He knows. I think he's aware of how he looks. You know what I mean? I think he plays with that. He's in the tradition of like James Cagney or Peter Lorre or something like that. Great
Mhm.
character actors who were like quite thin, quite not necessarily tall or imposing, but they knew how to play the screen so well, just in their movements, minor movements, really kind of. I think that contributed to Freddy Krueger, the
Yeah,
way he
his
walks,
theatrics.
the way he carries himself, the way he carries the shoulder, the arm with the glove. There's something about
Mhm.
the way he kind of nearly drags that, which is incredible, and it's all kind of theatrical, kind of mime work on Robert's part. But in terms of his career, yeah, I've seen him in so many movies down the years. Going back to like the '70s, Buster and Billy, Saint Ives, and of course there was the TV show V, which was on when I was a kid watching. When I first discovered Freddy, I also discovered V around the same time, and I was kind of like, the name kind of twigged at me. I was like, Robert Englund, that's Freddy, even though I'd never seen his face before. So that
Mhm.
was kind of a thrill. I used to love watching V and just waiting for Robert Englund's parts to come on each week because I just wanted to see Freddy without his makeup. So, Robert's been he's been in so many movies. Big Wednesday, A Star Is Born, the '70s version. There was a TV show back in the '90s called Nightmare Cafe, which didn't last too long. There was one season, I think, or a couple of episodes, but he was really good again as a host of that. So he's
Mhm.
just an incredible personality, and he's like that in real life. There's no when you see Robert Englund in an interview and he's talkative and he's animated. That's Robert in real life, and it's incredible. And as you say, he gave credence to those sociological discussions because if it just came from me and nobody else kind of reiterated them or agreed with me, I might have looked a bit silly because here's me, a 30 odd year old Irish guy writing about American innocence and the '60s. But Robert was able to say, no, you're right. That is exactly what it's about. And so for Robert to say that gives me or my theory credibility, at least, to me, I think it does. But
Yeah.
he went there and I was so happy that he did.
Yeah, and it tied perfectly into the narrative that you started forming right in like the first pages, the introduction of the book. It to see Robert England come back and um build on that and so effectively. Yeah, it was kind of like I did that was one of the things I did not expect to get out of the book. I was like, okay, we're gonna get some cool behind the scenes stories,
Yeah.
how the filmmakers felt about different things, some candid moments, but it was really cool to get that very like introspective view of the series from Freddy Krueger himself, and then elaborated on throughout the book by you as you broke it down in detail. It's just it was very thoughtful, just as like the first film was. What was the most challenging part when it came to writing Welcome to Elm Street?
I think I would say the most difficult chapter I've ever had to write in any book of my career was the one about part three, or at least it's the section about part three, because I was dealing with a lot of voices. You'll probably notice, I think it's either the biggest or the second biggest chapter in there, along with Freddy's Nightmares.
Mhm.
And there's so many voices, but there was a lot of conflicting personalities as well. It wasn't a very happy set. I don't know if you've talked to Roy Wagner yet. He might elaborate a bit more on that. But
Okay.
there was that movie was a strange mix of you had older Hollywood veterans, unionized veterans working on it, and they do things a certain way by the book, as expect, as should be, whatever. That's the way they work. But then you also had the non-union guys, the young guys who were coming in. They were kind of coming off that they were working in the new line independent spirit of just let's just get this, let's just make the best damn movie ever, whatever way we can. And so there was a bit of conflict there between kind of, I think, the old guard and the new guys coming in. And I wanted to be respectful to everybody. I did not want bitching to go on in the book. I didn't want one person to be dogging another. And there's a bit of argy-bargy, I think, in there. Some guys have their opinions about other guys, but I never let it be one-sided, and I hope it doesn't come across as one-sided in either respect. So just balancing those voices and balancing my own prose within that. Again, I didn't want it to go sidetracked into this, it's kind of the behind-the-scenes gossip kind of thing. Did not want that. I never want any of my books to be like that. I always want them to remain respectful to the subject matters. And at the end of the day, I respect all of these guys. I'm friends with some of them. So I didn't want any of them to feel, damn it, fucking you let somebody, bash me in that. So just putting that chapter together with an idea of fairness to everybody was probably the most challenging writing experience I had. If anything, David might remember this. I actually sent it to David because I was so kind of torn up about the chapter that I asked David, would he have a look? And of course, no one better, to have a perspective on working on a set, be it a commercial mainstream movie or a smaller independent movie. David would know what it was like. And, he told me, this is really, really good. You're doing the right thing. So I was happy with that. So I think that was it. I think that was the most challenging thing about this book, but also the most challenging experience I've had probably on all my books, was just putting that chapter together with a view to be fair, with a view for it to be not one-sided in any direction. And I just, at the end of the day, I love these movies, and I wouldn't want the book or that chapter to be tainted by kind of backstage gossip, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I totally get that. Like it's a fine line. I realize that we play this with when we do interviews with people as well. Sometimes things will be said and it's like they're not really saying anything that for anybody that's worked on a production set and appreciates like the level of intensity that's going on there and the stress, like they'd hear somebody say something and they'd understand like, okay, that's within the context of that environment, and it makes sense there. In the real world, in the daily life, in a cubicle job, that would be like, you're fired, how could you, that's so disrespectful. But in the intensity of a film set and everything that's going on there, some stories are like, they're totally justified. But then I try to remember that people will be watching these interviews that have no idea of that context and how they might perceive that, or how they might make them think of somebody in a negative light when it really shouldn't be conveyed that way. And it's this fine line of like being respectful to the truth, but also keeping in mind the perspective of the audience and not like of tainting something that we're here to celebrate. That I could definitely see that being a challenge for sure.
I mean, on part 3, a lot of people they said, working with Chuck Russell, it was Chuck Russell's first movie as a director, and they said, he was hard. He was a taskmaster. He was a kind of a hands-on, pushy director, but he was, as Roy said in the book, he was one of his great director cinematographer relationships. The man had a vision. And also, like Robert, I loved talking to Chuck because Chuck had that kind of Wes Craven-esque kind of intellectual understanding of the series and what it was about. And he tried to honor that, as well as making, a fun, entertaining step up in terms of just the spectacle of everything. He just wanted to make a damn good horror movie, but he also wanted to honor the themes of Wes Craven and all those kind of intellectual ideas. So I really loved talking to Chuck Russell. And again, I didn't want it to be a Chuck Russell bash fest, because you could easily let it become one of those things. I've seen it in documentaries where people were a bit kind of down on him, whatever. And I was like, I just want this to be fair, and I want it to be about the movie, because at the end of the day, the end goal was, let's just make the best damn movie, no matter whether they were the older guys, the younger guys, they just wanted to make the best damn movie they could, and I think they did because it's the best film in the franchise.
Yeah. Yeah, easily. Yeah, well, I'll get into what my I really like Freddy's Dead, and I know she has some things to say about that one, but I enjoy Freddy's Dead for what it was. But yeah, Dream Warriors was always the most. It was so conceptually fascinating to me that where they went with Dream Warriors, how you could um, build these strengths to defeat Freddy, uh, and like it was just they expanded on the lore exactly the way a sequel should.
Right.
The Going back to the original Nightmare on Elm Street, the open and shot, that was so cool to me when I was reading your book to learn that that was practically all in camera. Even the speed change and the haziness, how he used Jacques Haykin. Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Okay, how Jacques Hayquin, the cinematographer, he literally hand painted the pieces of glass that people were pulling to create that haze, and that about how they had that prototype device that was they were practically the first to use it to auto shift the iris with the speed that was never used before on a film set, and then doing your research for the book, like was there and the interviews as well, was there ever something that like stands out to you that was mind blowing in any particular way to hear and I'm sorry if I gave the example that was going to be yours, but that's what like blew my mind, because I always assumed that there was some kind of digital trickery going on there.
Well, as a cinematography buff, that was actually
I'm
probably the
sorry.
one where I'm like, I was like, wow, this is fascinating, because I don't know what it is about cinematographers. There's something on every book. I always try and talk to cinematographers because they have one foot in the technical world and another foot in the storytelling world.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what Jock was about. Jock said himself in the book, I'm a story guy. So he would, before shooting starts, he would have those kind of thematic discussions with Wes or with Jack Shoulder. But he says, once you're on set, it's get the shot. You're not going to be having those esoteric discussions while you're on the set. You're too busy setting up the shot. But he says those are the ideas that informs his shots, beforehand. So Roy Wagner's the same. Roy Wagner's a brilliant person to talk to about story and about how lighting and framing, informs and embellishes certain themes and parts of the story. So I always love talking to cinematographers. I'm trying to think, is there any other moment like that stood out? But I can't really think of it at the moment.
Fasc
But
Fascinating was the perfect word. That's I was very, very fascinated by that whole, just the how he went so specific into the like technical details of how he accomplished that shot was so gratifying to read.
yeah,
Just because like you know like I don't ever think that like a big Hollywood picture is like doing makeshift stuff like that to pull something off creatively. I always assumed that like, because like everything that he talked about in that paragraph of how they accomplished that shot, um, somebody could somebody could do right now with their cat. Like they could pull that off with enough practice, and that you don't need $100,000 to accomplish that shot. And that's just it's so cool
that's what
to
I miss about the 80s. Like, that everything was in camera. It was
yeah.
performed for real. And as he said, it was 5 guys on the camera, all working in sync, doing whatever it was to achieve that. But, it pays off when you look at that shot. I mean, a prime example of the difference between those kind of effects works versus, the kind of contemporary kind of digital effects. Look at the remake, which you probably tell in the book that I'm not a fan of. If you look at shot for shot, say go from certain scenes and compare them, and the difference, the remake, even though they spent God knows how many tens of millions making it, looks like a cheap ass cartoon. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It does not look good at all. It looks like the cutscenes from a video game or something. But then you go back to the original and you think, this is all in camera. It's done with lighting. It's done with framing and body positions, whatever else. It's done for real and done a hell of a lot cheaper than they did for the remake. And I think that's a prime example of why the 80s and the 70s and the 80s were such good eras for especially horror filmmaking. because you knew even sometimes if it looked a little bit cheap or a little bit dodgy, it was still done for real.
It was
You
still
know,
something you could touch. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, even the best CGI right now, it's removed from it still removes me from reality because there's like I still there's something instinctually in me. It's like I can't touch that. That's not tangible. It has no real threat or impact on but yeah, the practical effects were always so good. Now, I want to we're gonna like fan out for just a few minutes here. I have just a few like quick questions about the franchise. What so you said number 3, Dream Wars is your favorite in the franchise, right?
oh yeah.
Okay, so
Now
that's
I have a couple of ones which kind of nearly tie for it, but
what's your honorable mentions?
okay, of course, part 1.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of part 6, Freddy's Dead. You know,
Mhm.
I just think I know it gets bashed completely for its weird sense of humor and all, but for me, again, there's a lot of really good stuff thematically in there, and I love all that kind of '90s pop culture references. You know, to Twin Peaks, to Simpsons, to Roseanne. And I even really like the soundtrack. I mean, the Goo Goo Dolls stuff in there is terrific. It's before they
Yeah.
kind of went into the middle of the road and tried to sound like Bon Jovi light, but
Mhm.
the early Goo Goo Dolls stuff was quite good. Iggy Pop's on the soundtrack. You know, it's really fucking cool movie. Part 4, I think, is up there as well. It's just a great big action spectacle. It's the MTV one. You know, it's the one with
Yeah.
the kind of the pop and new wave soundtrack, the really flashy visuals. Steven Fireberg was the DP on that. Really loved talking to him. He was great. And again, he comes from an art background. He comes from the same indie world as Tom DiCillo. So to see him going from having worked on these really low budget, 16 millimeter indie movies, art movies in the early 80s, to doing this beautiful Hollywood studio horror movie is really fascinating for me. But I think the ones which are lesser for me would be part 5, The Dream Child. I think it was just too heavy handed, too gothic, and just too, again, interesting themes, but maybe not dealt with in the way. It's not very, it's a bit on the nose, the whole kind of the abortion stuff, the single mother stuff, it's just not handled very well because they get into some deep things and then all of a sudden it's just a cheap slash and hack 'em up, whatever, the next
Mhm.
moment. So I don't know, something about it I just never really connected with. Part 7, I think, is ingenious in terms of the way that it's a meta movie. It's the kind of an intertextual kind of thing. It's not. I look at the franchise, at the formal franchise, as 1 to 6, and I think New Nightmare is a little bit kind of on the periphery of it. I would never
Yeah.
consider it 1 to 7. So Freddy versus Jason, it's fine. I'm not a huge fan of it. And then the remake, good luck. But yeah, I would say 3 number 1. 3 is number 1 for me, circled by part 1, part 4, and part 6.
Yeah, I'm very similar to you. Like I love Dream Wars is my favorite. I love Freddy's Dead, and your book actually explained to me what I couldn't explain to myself why I appreciated Freddy's Dead so much, and it was that David Lynchian aspect to it that I couldn't even put words on that. That's what was there that I was appreciating so much about it. But it was they like adding the Lynchian aspect to it almost made reality as unsettling as the dream world was. And then they took the murders of the dream world and just upped the ante and the creativity and the outlandishness of those even more to
Yeah.
contrast the Lynchian reality that was happening in that movie. And I love the death scenes. I love the video game sequence. Like it was easily the most I've ever laughed at A Nightmare on Elm Street and really enjoyed the ride. Like right from the beginning
Oh,
with the bus and the guy falling so violently through the sky. Yeah, it was just such a fun. It was a hell of a ride.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, but yeah, I do have to say another honorable mention is part 2, Freddy's Revenge, which I know it's been kind of celebrated again in pop culture in the last few years for its kind of the homoerotic stuff, and it's kind of
Mhm.
like the male scream queen. But apart from that, just thinking about the series now, it was probably the one that I wouldn't say scared me. I was never scared by Elm Street, but it's the one that freaked me out a little bit more than any other one. There's a certain tone to it, which
Yeah.
is it's very hard to describe. I think Jack Shoulder did a really great job. It's not a Wes Craven type Elm Street movie. There's something different about it. It's more physical. It's more body horror. It's kind of almost Cronenbergian, if you want to put it like that. But
Yeah.
it's definitely the one that unsettled me the most. So honorable mention part two. It's not in the bottom half. It's not in the top half. It's in between.
Yeah, and I've seen people really like get upset with the fact that like Freddy just casually makes his way into the real world and attacks people at the pool. But for me, I remember like that was terrifying and it was so exciting. I'm like, oh shit, now he's here. Like it
Yep.
was just so neat to see
Yeah.
and the way they brought that. But yeah, I agree. That one is probably aside from the first one, is the scariest in the franchise to me because there is this just very it's a very dark undertones. Even Freddy is like he's still got the one-liners, but even his one-liners are kind of
Yeah.
threatening and
And his makeup is actually quite frightening in it. I think it's of all the makeups, there's something about it. He's very emaciated looking, or there's something, I don't know, bonier about it. I don't know. I can't really describe it, but there's something about his look in that film. His eyes feel bigger. They're not as kind of enclosed with the mask as they usually are. But it's yeah, like I'm not too picky about kind of the whole coming into the real world thing. I that wouldn't upset me too much. I'm not that hardcore.
yeah.
To kind of not like the film because of that. Those kind of things. So you take each film on its own merit. You know what I mean? So
It was just really cool to I think what made that so cool to me is I feel like Freddy deserved that moment because in most of the time with nightmares, he can only most like attack one person at a time. It was just so cool to see him like bust into a pool party and unleash his hell on everybody at once. Like you're all in the nightmare. The nightmare has come to you.
yeah,
That was just so neat. And with Freddy versus Jason, I think I get everything that people say about that. The criticisms are all very warranted. I think why it holds such a special place in my heart is because my older cousins actually got me into Nightmare on Elm Street. They live up north in Pennsylvania. I lived down south for most of my life, and we went back up north around the time that the holidays. I think it was like November, December when that movie came out, and we went and saw. I actually got to go to the theaters and see the movie with my cousins that got me into the franchise to begin with, and it was just a cool experience. And being in the theater with all the Freddy fans that haven't been in a movie theater together in a decade, that was like the energy of it. I think lives with me more than the movie itself does. But it was really crazy when I read your book. That was surprising to me that the director, like I remember like the way I felt when I saw that movie is like, oh man, this director really gets the spirit of like what the first Nightmare on Elm Street was about. Like I felt like there were a lot of great callbacks, and then to see in the book that he like intentionally tried to avoid pleasing the fans of the original franchise and in like a certain way, like he didn't want to just that was crazy to me to see that because I didn't get that I didn't get that at all from watching it, and maybe
yeah.
it was just because of my experience.
I mean, yeah. I think no matter how kind of how do you say how much your allegiance would be with say either Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, I don't think no director is ever going to satisfy the fans 100%. You're always going to have a contingent who are, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you're breaking the rules there, that kind of thing. So he probably knew that, you know what I mean? Kind of coming in cold is probably the best perspective to just make the best movie he can from the script and not worry too much about, the kind of minor details. And because you're crossing over two franchises that are really not related at all. They're in different universes, they're
Yeah,
different approaches to horror and, whatever. One's kind of based in reality, and then the other is kind of based in the dream world, and then you're never going to satisfy everybody. So I think it was a good approach to have, but just as a movie, it was thrilling to see those two guys, on a cinema screen together. But as a movie, it didn't satisfy what I like about both of those franchises on either level. To me, like the Friday the 13th, what's great about Friday the 13th is those first up to maybe the first eight. And I do like the Friday the 13th franchise. They're kind of gritty looking. They're cheap, and there's a certain gritty quality to them. They're not polished. They're not beautiful looking movies.
Yeah.
So I missed that because Freddy versus Jason is very well shot. It's a beautiful looking movie. And in terms of Nightmare on Elm Street, it didn't have really any of the themes that I love about the Elm Street. It didn't really. There's not a whole lot of depth there. It's it's a team slash 'em up, whatever. Now
Yeah.
there is a nice kind of reference to the medicated teens of Elm Street and kind of the hypnosil thing that they're kind of being administered. That's a nice kind of throwback to part three, and
Hmm.
the Dream Warriors and all that. But other than that, it was kind of lacking in what I like about both franchises, even though it's a fun hour and a half. Yeah.
Yeah, and the CGI didn't really hold. CGI never really holds up that well. I mean, that the one thing I do remember really distinctly from that film is Kelly Rowland's nose when she's that. I was like, oh my god, why is the blood in a different frame rate than the film that it's being
Yeah.
shot on? That's so weird. What are you doing? Um, what's your favorite Freddy line in all the franchise?
I quoted it earlier on, but it's every town has an Elm Street. And again, it's because of the resonance, and that's from Freddy's Dead. It's the resonance that it has for me. It comes back to why I wrote this book, and it comes back to why I love the series and its ideas, which is that yeah, every town does have an Elm Street. Not by name, but just by what Elm Street represents, which is broken families, broken dreams, aspirations, for a better life, kind of the middle class American dream, which is kind of
Hmm.
torn asunder by this guy who kind of represents, the hinted at other side of the tracks in Springwood. He was a factory worker or whatever he was. He was definitely kind of more blue collar than we are used to seeing in the Elm Street franchise. So there's a kind of a social tension there, I think, as well, because if you look at all these kids, they come from very kind of, you know, ignorant households, I would say. They're medicated, they're kind of shunned aside by their parents who have their own issues as well. And I think that can, as I say, that can apply to any street in any neighborhood, regardless of economics, or
Yeah.
country. You're going to have damaged kids, damaged parents, but you'll have people who are trying to do good, but they just can't quite make it. I think that's one of the great themes of Elm Street is that Freddy is the great disruptor. He's the guy who's, you have your nice suburban tract house with your preened lawns and picket fence. Well, guess what? I'm going to come in and fucking ruin your life,
Yeah. I think.
And he represents a lot. He represents, depending on which film you're looking at. He like in Freddy's Dead, for example. He represents the ignorance of the father. The rich father. Kind of casting his kid aside and treating him like an object. He represents to Tracy, sexual abuse, the abuse of the father on her, and the abusive mother, the physically abusive mother with Carlos.
Yeah.
He's actually in that film. He's actually quite, he's quite vindictive. He really goes for the kids who had it hard. In the other movies, he goes for those, like I say, those kind of comfortable middle class kids who have the rich parents. Usually their affliction is daddy's not home because he's at the office all the time. But in Freddy's Dead, the parents are there and they're really, really, vicious to the kids. So it's a different kind of depiction of the parents, I think, in Freddy's Dead, but it's a very interesting one. But I think that's why Every Town Has an Elm Street is my favorite Freddy Krueger quote, because of what the universality of what it means.
Yeah. I think my favorite line is I think it's Dream Warriors where he says I am eternal.
Eternal.
Just the delivery of that line, and I feel like it's almost like a premonition of Freddy's legacy in the real world. Is that he's at this point he is like you have the Universal monsters from back in the day, and he reigns supreme over the slasher films of the 80s and 90s, or yeah, the 80s and 90s, and I don't see him. I feel like he'll always be a part of the zeitgeist of society in some way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that line is great in the context of that movie as well, because there's a lot of religious imagery in that. And the whole thing of I am eternal, there's a certain kind of religious connotation to that.
That's right. He says
Um,
it in a church, even.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's that, which again adds that other layer of subtext to that movie, which is all this kind of religious, kind of imagery and iconography that's going on. So that's what I'm saying. These films are really, they're very rich for analysis, and that's why, I guess, why I was able to get a book out of them.
Do you have a favorite kill or dream sequence?
Oh yeah, the marionette sequence in part 3.
Oh God, yeah.
That was the one years ago when I was a kid watching that. I think it was the only kill that ever kind of made me wince, because I'm terrible at like kind of medical stuff and body horror, if you want to put it like that. So that, seeing the open wounds and the veins popping out and all that, Jesus Christ! But it's so imaginative. It's such a great scene. I love the way the Angelo Badalamenti's music kicks in, the real
Yeah.
80s synth score, just as kind of Philip is walking and the guys notice him. It's a very exciting scene, and I think the image of Freddy in the sky as he's dangling Philip, by the veins, Freddy consumes the whole sky, and that's a terrifying image, because he's so huge. He's just, it's like you can't escape him. He is sky. He is air. He is the elements. I think that's just a wonderfully achieved scene from a filmmaking point of view as well.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree with you on that. That was the most effective. It was not funny at all. There was nothing really humorous about it, but it was terrifying. Like, I don't know, have you ever pulled the hangnail too far?
Oh
And
yeah,
there's that moment where it hits the skin and maybe pulls up like, oh, stop.
yeah.
Like the his tendons being pulled up like that, it gives me the hangnail feeling over my whole body just
Oh,
thinking
yeah.
about it. Like the practical effects of that was done so well. And even with Freddy in the sky, for like to pull off like a comp shot like that in the 80s and not have it be like distracting like that, it felt like a nightmare. It was so, yeah, that's a very good one. And the most disturbing easily, because the implication of that too. I mean, the kid's in a psych ward, and he's like that. It's just so taboo to
Oh,
he to frame somebody for their own suicide that's in a psych ward. Like, God damn, Freddy, you don't get much more evil than that.
no, and again, it comes back to what Freddy represents, which is absolute and utter horror. It's horror in the home, and it's horror. It's personal horror. It's not, at the end of the day, the things that Freddy is doing and making them kind of, the way he kind of sets them up to make it look as whatever way they were killed. There's a certain resonance that is, especially in that case, very harrowing. And like I say, going back to Freddy's Dead, where he's evoking the abuse of parents, be it physical or sexual. So
Yeah,
it's a very deep, unsettling thing that he's doing, that the filmmakers are doing there. But I think it's a wise thing, and I think it's an important thing, because it's drawing attention to very serious things that go on in life, unfortunately, that
yeah.
maybe younger people mightn't be aware, not that we wouldn't be aware of, but they mightn't have a kind of an engagement with, with movies
Mhm.
otherwise. You know what I mean? I mean, that those are the kind of things that it's probably your first consideration of them when you're watching an entertainment like Nightmare on Elm Street, to all of a sudden be presented with very dark things like that, very dark themes.
Yeah,
And I think it's a great thing, because it gets people thinking about
yeah.
horrendous things.
Yeah, like tricks them into addressing things that are like the most uncomfortable aspects of society. Okay, so I gathered from your book, and you kind of brought this up in the interview, that you were not a fan of the 2010 remake. I have conflicted feelings about that, so I wanted to talk to you about where you think it went wrong, and if there's any places that you think it went right.
Well, I think it went excuse me, it went wrong in its execution for a start. It's completely style over substance. There's none of the depth of any of the previous films in there at all. It's very on the surface kind of stuff. It's just a stock and slash movie. And as I say, the digital effects, I think, look terrible. It has this horrible look to it, which is very, I guess, typical of a lot of contemporary horror movies, which is it has this kind of greeny, kind of horrible look to it. Just the cinematography is a very ugly looking movie. Um, the one thing I did like about it is that it did go a bit deeper into kind of the Freddy lore. Now, it didn't do it in great depth or whatever, but it's there. But it's only alluded to, and it's only for the sake of getting you to another terrible kill scene. But I don't know. It's just I reviewed it actually. I was working for a newspaper at the time when I reviewed it, and I was excited to again be writing about an Elm Street movie, but the movie was so disappointing that I just, as you'll see in the book, I don't spend a whole lot of time talking about it because it's just a depressing experience and it's just not fun.
Yeah, it was yeah. I agree with everything you said. I think what I appreciated about it was that they didn't like. I think this came out around the time there's so many, everything's getting a remake and a reboot, and it's like a lot of the times they don't justify their own existence because like you haven't really offered anything different than the original gave me, or you've made it worse. And I think what I appreciated about the 2010 remake, specifically Jackie Early Haley, was had the courage that it must have took to completely turn Freddy Krueger on his head as far as what fans would be expecting from the iconic character that makes that is the, as Robert Englund puts it, the silhouette, the brand, the Mickey Mouse of Nightmare on Elm Street. Like to take that character and just everything that you would expect, do pretty much the opposite.
That's music to my ears.
I just really like Jackie Early Haley's performance, as jarring as it was, and as Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger, and that Freddy Krueger will always be the best Freddy Krueger.
I am eternal.
But I did appreciate the fact that they tried to at least give us something different. And then, in your book, I love that Robert Englund actually comes out and definitively says Freddy is not a pedophile. He's a child killer. He's killing innocents. He's killing the future. I did like a part of me appreciated that aspect of the 2010 remake too, that they expanded on that and made him even just more unforgivable and irredeemable as a character, and somebody that we shouldn't be laughing at or feeling entertained by. They kind of gave it the Evil Dead treatment where they just went total dark, and there's nothing redeemable. You should not be idolizing this character. He's meant to terrify you, and he's meant to be a terrible person, and they leaned into that. So I appreciated the conviction, I guess, of the filmmakers, but as a fan of Nightmare on Elm Street, I was disappointed. I think that's how a lot of people must have felt.
Yeah, and I think in terms of casting, you're not going to get any better than Jackie Earle Haley to replace Robert if you're going to do it, because he's a terrific actor.
Yeah.
And, in and of itself, his performance is creepy and it's insidious, but it's just a shame that what he's surrounded with, the film and the script and everything. And the look of him as well, I think he just looks like a rat. It's just,
yeah. It's like, all right, I like it's different. I'll give you that, but different isn't always. Yeah, like where'd your chin go, man? So, well, speaking of casting, and let's put Jackie Earle Haley aside since he had his chance. Pretend we live in a world where Robert Englund never existed, because I know it's sacrilegious to even ask this question. So, in this hypothetical universe, there is no Robert Englund. It's the saddest universe of all the universes. Jackie Earle Haley also is off the table. Is there any other actor, past or present, who you'd be interested in seeing take a swing at Krueger?
I could only really see maybe 2 or 3 people who would have the personality and the screen presence to do that. And I'm thinking James Cagney, Robert Blake, maybe Peter Lorre, somebody who have the very distinctive look and cadence to them, but who are also very physical in their, speaking of cats, they kind of have a wiliness to them, kind of a nimble screen presence, which Robert has. But there's something about their face as well, which is very distinctive features, and I think that's crucial to Freddy Krueger, even though he's covered in makeup. But that's the great thing about Robert, even though he's caked in makeup and masks or whatever, he's still able to express very vividly his emotions in a scene. And I think you'd have to have someone like, as I say, Cagney, Laurie, Robert Blake, who could pull that off. Now, I would never want to see that. I would never want to see anybody other than Robert Englund.
Yeah.
Even that, David Warner was originally supposed to be cast or something like that for Freddy, and David Warner was brilliant, but I don't want him to be Freddy Krueger. He's almost too theatrical. He's too, in a classical sense. Robert's theatrical, but in a different way. David Warner has a very classical kind of, almost, I don't know, is he English or was he American? I think he was English. Very British kind of demeanor.
Yeah.
I don't know. He's an actor. I'm sure he could have made it his own.
I love that essentially your answer is, look, I understand the hypothetical that you presented, that we're in a universe without Robert Englund, but instead of using my resources to recast Freddy Krueger, I'm instead going to repurpose those resources into traveling to the universe where Robert Englund actually still exists, so this can be made right. I would like to see, just because of his commitment to whatever character he plays, I would be interested to see what Christian Bale would do with a character like Freddy Krueger that is, so embedded in the fabric of our society, like how he would approach that and what spin he would take on it. And, the appearance, I wouldn't be surprised if Christian Bale actually lit himself on fire as a method actor to really he likes to embody whatever character he's playing. He's like, I'll get these scars fixed after production wraps,
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's God, when you think of Robert Englund in that role, and I think it's just, it's everything. It's, you can't pick out one thing. It's the humor, it's the posture, it's his acting chops. It's a mix of everything. But I think it comes down to his keen intelligence and understanding of Wes's teams. That to me, would be crucial to anybody approaching this, is that they have a kind of an intellectual insight and understanding into what this is all about. And I don't think that the remake would have given Jackie Earle Haley that kind of platform. You know what I mean? Because there's nothing really there for him to dig into on any level other than, I'm Freddy Krueger and I'm going to kill you. I think there's so much more to Freddy Krueger and Robert Englund, obviously, than that.
Yeah, the personality was lacking in such a way that you couldn't. It was inescapable. This doesn't feel like, you take the personality out of Freddy, then it's not really Nightmare on Elm Street anymore. It becomes something entirely different.
Yeah.
Is that what you think?
Has he ever made an appearance in any of your nightmares?
Man, I never sleep. You wouldn't have enough time to invade my nightmares.
I'm a writer. I don't sleep.
I haven't slept in 5 years. But no, in terms of kind of affecting me in some kind of way, not really, because going back to what I said before, when I was a kid, he enthralled me, he entertained me, he amused me. So I've never had a kind of a chilling experience over Freddy, other than the odd scene like the marionette one is kind of I'd say, whoa, that's horrible kind of thing. But no, I've never horror movies in general. I've been watching films for mature audiences long before I should have been, and they've never really affected me like that. They've had the opposite effect on me, in that they've kind of opened me up to the world and kind of made me think about things that I wouldn't have otherwise. But no, I don't think Freddy has ever affected me like that. And which is weird, because I remember actually one time I was talking about horror history, and I was showing an example of Nightmare on Elm Street to a class of teenagers. And there was, a couple of kids who were I saw them, they were kind of like hugging each other and kind of shaking. And I thought, wow, they're having such a great time with this horror movie. This is what it's all about, reacting, viscerally, whatever. And then the other teacher in the room said, I think we better turn off this scene. Those kids they're actually terrified of that moment. I was like, oh shit. I didn't realize that teenagers these days get afraid of old movies like A Nightmare on Elm Street.
That's weird.
So on one hand, I was happy that Freddy still has the power to scare people. But on the other hand, then I realized, well, some people are more sensitive than the others when it comes to watching these things.
Yeah, for me, it was a really, I share that sentiment with you, that I always just felt entertained by Freddy, and I understood that these things were movies, that these were makeup artists doing amazing jobs, and I appreciated the artistry that went into these films. So it's always been that experience for me too. And Freddy was just he was never somebody. I never felt like Freddy was a threat to me. I always
Mm.
felt like he was just somebody like I enjoy watching him be a threat to other people, and that's where my relationship with him begins and ends. I knew he was a fictional character. Um, but it was that's why it's so strange to me. I've had one terrifying nightmare in my entire life, and I rarely dream. But this one, it was Freddy. Freddy was in it, and it's just that's what was so scary to me is it didn't make sense to me how like this guy doesn't scare me, not like this, not like to my core, not like I'm not. But the dream wasn't funny. I wasn't entertained by him. I was in a house with my family, and only I could see Freddy coming down the road towards our house, and I knew he was coming to come into our house and murder myself and all of my family. So the whole dream I'm taking furniture and I'm trying to move everything and block all the doors and windows, and I keep looking out there and he's getting closer, and it's just I'm terrified. I'm more terrified than I've ever been in real life or in dream. Uh, and I just feel the impending doom of Freddy approaching. And I can't get the stuff in front of the doors and windows fast enough. And it seems like every time I put something in front of the door, the thing that I had put there before had moved. Like I'm making no progress. And as soon as I do get everything there, I turn around and Freddy's already in the house anyway. And I wake up. And that just I could have never put two and two together. How like this it's almost like having a nightmare about your mom or you love. Like I have nothing but admiration for this character, but then at the same time, I also felt I've paid my respect in the greatest way possible to Freddie.
Yeah.
Now I've been a sacrifice at his altar. I've allowed him to terrify me. It's just this weird dichotomy with the relationship of Freddie and him scaring and entertaining me and growing up with him. That the nightmare never made sense to me. How
Yeah.
like I'm not afraid of Freddy Krueger, but when I was in that dream, I felt exactly the way the kids did in those movies and have like fanning out in the dream while also being terrified at the same time.
Well, he's a powerful image, man. I mean, just the image of the scissor hands, the knives alone are just it's a deeply disturbing image in and of itself. And I think you put the hat on him and the tattered clothes, and yeah, he looks a cross between some guy you might meet down on Skid Row somewhere begging for change, and someone who would invade your dreams and kill you. So yeah,
Yeah.
he ticks all
And
the kind of boxes of what's going to frighten you on a physical level. But then there's the implications of what he represents. Again, to me, it's the physical version of Freddy would never terrify me, but what he represents is very real and very terrifying. Which is, as I say, all those things that happen.
so though before we move on from Nightmare on Elm Street, one last question about that particular series. If you could pitch a Nightmare on Elm Street to revive the franchise with Robert Englund on board, what would your like? How would you like to see the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise continued?
Oh man, I'd be such a killjoy. I'd be like, take it back to Freddy's origins. Why did he end up the way he is? Almost expand upon like the pilot episode of Freddy's Nightmares, which is all about the trial and being caught and burned and all that. Kind of what they touch upon in the remake. Only do it. I would do it as a serious movie, not as one of the big production number Freddy sequels. Take it back to its serious roots.
Hmm.
What was Freddy like growing up? Why did he become again, this is touched upon lightly in Freddy's Dead, the abuse of his father and being bullied in school and all that. Take us back to that. What was Springwood like back then? What's it like as a kind of a on a social level? Because there's obviously some disparity going on. I
Yeah.
think between the rich and the poor in that town. And there's some kind of element there that it's like as if Freddy is going towards the kind of the kids of the affluent, the kind of the other side of the how would you say the side of town that he would never be a part of, you
Hmm.
know. But I would love I like a bit of psychological social realism in my movies, even in fantastic horror movies. So that's the way I'd go. Now, what role would Robert play in it? I don't know. Maybe the dad, Freddy's dad or something like that.
Interesting.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think for me, that's the place I would want to see it go is some kind of backstory that is honorable to Wes Craven and his ideas. That's the way I go.
Yeah. I feel like to avoid the pitfall that they ran into in 2010, I think that the next life that Freddy should see is in the form of like uh, an episodic like a series on net like a I don't want to say Netflix series, but some kind of like I think of like Cobra Kai or Stranger Things. The way the like if you have like or like the Freddy's Nightmares series, kind of harken back to that. If there's, I think there's a playground there to have fun with the concept like Nightmare on Elm Street, where it could be, a different. It could follow a group of kids, and each kid has their own episode, their own nightmare. That Freddy's, I think changing the medium that Freddy is reintroduced on would be less offensive to the diehard Nightmare on Elm Street fans that are like, okay, you're not remaking the movie, you're
Yeah.
bringing him over to a series.
It's kind of like you're expanding the universe kind of thing.
Yeah, it would give them the opportunity to really expand on the lore of Freddy and stuff because each episode could be one part expanding on the lore and the history, and one part present day nightmare teenager. Yeah, and it seems like all the like with the remake of It and Stranger Things, it's like that dynamic of like the 80s experience growing up is making a comeback all over again, where something like that would I guess Nightmare on Elm
Yeah.
Street story would fit into the theme of things right now thematically.
That's it. I think if anybody was ever going to go back to Elm Street, the main thing is to be kind of respectful to Wes Craven's intentions with it. And I think that comes down to kind of the teams, to kind of reduce him to just being a kind of a stock and slash kind of figure would be to do a total disjustice to the series, because that's Jason Voorhees, Friday the 13th territory. He's just a guy who kind of hacks teenagers with no kind of no context other than the teenagers are in his woods. I think with Elm Street, there's too many big important ideas in there. The seeds are there for really important ideas, and I think any further investigations or trips down to Elm Street need to kind of honor those. Otherwise, it's going to be redundant, like the remake, I think.
Yeah. I'd love to see Robert Englund step into the shoes one more time. And I feel like he would even require less prosthetics now too. Like he can get into the Freddy getup with just, I'm not bashing him in any way, but you get old, you get the wrinkles going on. Well, I'm looking forward to the the age and the wisdom that looks like you come to being an old begrudging looking man. But yeah, I mean, I think he's still got the physical prowess to bring Freddy to life. And
Well, yeah,
why not?
I could see he'd have the gusto to do it justice. He still has. As I say, from talking to him, that man is so full of life and ideas that.
Yeah,
It'd be a shame for him not to do it again one more time, maybe. But as long as the movie's good, I think that's
yeah, that would be a terrible way to like tarnish. So like what happened in 2010, the silver lining is that Robert Englund's name wasn't on it, Wes Craven's name wasn't on it, so there's no like true legacy tarnished by the mishap that happened there. But it would be a shame for Robert Englund's last role of Freddy to be lackluster.
Oh, yeah.
It would have to be superb. All right, there you have it. Once again, want to give a huge shout out to Wayne Byrne and Roy H. Wagner. Again, you can go get Wayne's book, available right now, Welcome to Elm Street. If you are a Nightmare on Elm Street fan, highly recommend checking that out. And don't miss their full interviews. Roy will be on December 8th, and Wayne will be on December 15th. Those will be available right here on TTFT. Have a safe and happy Halloween, and sleep tight.